Okay, welcome everyone to today's AABHL teaching stream webcast, How Do You Teach Health, Ethics and Law? My name is Mary Claire Balnaves and I am one of the AABHL teaching stream leads. And today we have the wonderful Dr. Diego Silva here with us. How are you today, Diego?
I'm well, how are you doing?
Yeah, good.
Excellent.
It's really nice to have you here to talk about teaching, purely because I've been on the other end of being a student for you.
That's right, yeah.
So it's going to be really nice to step through a few series of questions of how you teach ethics, Diego. But it would be great if you could kind of tell and share with everyone, I guess, who you are and what you do in the realm of bioethics.
Yeah, so first off, again, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. So my research is in public health ethics, primarily around infectious diseases. So the methods
very topical.
Yeah. COVID, I joke around, I feel like an ambulance chaser, like COVID's been good for business. Yeah, so I approach the topics around infectious disease ethics from a variety of perspectives. So I do qualitative research and conceptual, more philosophical work as well. Write policy pieces, so on and so forth. So work by myself, work with teams. Seems to keep me occupied and keep my focus going. So I'm really much interested, or very much interested in essentially how political theory applies in the context of infectious diseases. So when we think, personally for me, I'm interested in how we think through liberty and autonomy in the context of public health. So that's a little bit about the research and kind of my perspective on bioethics.
And I'm sure a lot of people would want to be discussing with you about how liberty and autonomy is enacted within public health at the moment, but we're here to talk about how you teach ethics.
Absolutely.
So I guess with all the things that you do in your research, what do you teach about?
Yeah.
Do you just teach about public health, or do you do a little bit of
So I've taught, I think, the gamut of students, so from undergrads to professionals. Right now, I'm the program director of the bioethics program here at the University of Sydney. So that includes our Masters of Bioethics as well as the grad dip and grad cert.
Yeah.
So I'm very privileged to have that job and take it very seriously. So I actually teach right now postgrad students, and I teach into the research ethics unit, which is the one that we had together.
Yeah.
And I also teach into, and that's within the Masters of Bioethics. And then I also teach into the Masters of Public Health. And so I'm in charge of teaching ethics into this one core unit within the Masters of Public Health. And then I also do teaching into the med school and a few other odds and ends and guest lecture and stuff like that. So again, I think it's interesting that we're having this conversation, because I think for me, I have very different audiences, very different sort of types of students that come across me or come across my teaching. So it's never dull.
Yeah. So when you're approaching an audience, it sounds like postgrad's one of the key audiences you teach to at the moment.
Right now, yeah.
Okay, so when you're approaching a postgraduate audience, how do you approach it? Do you have a certain style? Do you use certain resources? How do you go about it?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because there are certain units in the bioethics program that I think it's just the Masters of Bioethics students that just take them.
Yeah.
And I think those ones you can sort of tailor it to a higher postgraduate level in Masters of Bioethics. There's a few units, especially and one of them being the research ethics one that I teach into, where it's Masters of Bioethics as well as people from outside the bioethics program. So higher degree research students taking it, whatever the case might be. And the reason I raise that is because actually it becomes stratified, the type of students that you get in the unit as well. And so it's a challenge to try to think through, how do you teach a unit in a way that is going to be engaging and satisfactory and the type of thing that you would want a postgrad in bioethics to learn about, while at the same time sort of being able to appeal to and make sense for those outside of the bioethics program. So it's a bit of a balance that way. And then on the public health unit course that I teach, it's very much introductory. And my approach isn't necessarily to start with theory, but to start with problems, and to sort of think through, okay, you know, kind of demonstrate how do we think through problems, as opposed to sort of saying, here's, you know, a particular theory, a particular principle, or something like that. So it really does depend on who it is. The approach will differ that way.
Yeah, so you're having to be quite flexible in the way that you approach it and to tailor who you're kind of capturing at the time.
Correct.
When you're talking about problems that you start people to think through first before you get to theories, what type of problems would you discuss?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So so if it's a non-bioethics audience,
Mm-hmm.
You know, one particular lecture I really enjoy giving, this is just as an example, to the Masters of Public Health students, is around eco-health.
Yeah.
And ethical issues around eco-health. But I think the idea of ecology is going to be sort of something that they come across throughout their MPH. It's something that they probably have a sense of what that is. So what I do is I try to look at, what do we mean by eco, the prefix.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you look at it, it means dwelling or home. Okay, that's interesting, right? What do we mean when we're saying home? And then from home, you can get into discussions of place and space, and discussions of place and space as it relates to Australia. So you can then touch on issues of Australia's immigration policies.
Yeah.
You can touch on built environment. You can, you know, there's different ways that you can sort of go in different directions by looking at, maybe problem's not the right word, but by looking at, what do we mean by home? What do we mean by place and space? So I guess that's I guess what I meant by sort of the more problem-based approach, is to sort of approach it from something that is much more tangible than saying consequentialism this, you know, non-consequentialism that.
Yeah, so you start with a topic that's tangible.
Yeah, topic's probably a better word than problem. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a good thing to clarify, because then I guess so, and then with the topic, that helps you to tease out like a bit of a choose your own adventure situation of how you start to think about the topic to show its complexities.
Yeah, I think, again, for the Masters of Public Health, this is how I do it, right? So this is for more of a generalist, non-ethics audience. This is definitely how I do it.
Yeah.
For an ethics audience, I think, for ethics students, stop calling them audience, but for ethics students, my approach is slightly different. So there, my approach is to say, what are the fundamental, again, topics or ideas or polemics? Like, what are the points of friction underneath the questions that underpin a particular discipline?
Yeah.
So, so again, I'll just use examples that I do, or that I know about. So for research ethics, yes, we touched on informed consent and confidentiality and all that stuff. But the primary things that we were looking at, that we spent a lot of time on, was looking at things like, well, what do we mean by harm? So if we want to protect the research subject from harm, how do we understand that idea? Research is a lot about dealing with uncertainty. So how do we deal with uncertainty? What does it mean to be uncertain? And so from that, you can then touch on sort of the bread and butter research ethics stuff. But to me, it's much more interesting to look at, what are the assumptions? What are the underlying ideas? What's sort of underneath the hood? And for me, the reason is that, hopefully, if it works well, understanding those concepts allows the student flexibility as they move forward to then apply the ideas from the unit in their practice. as opposed to sort of merely saying, this is what informed consent is, this is what confidentiality is, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, so you're actually getting them to think about what prejudgments or assumptions have come about to what principles they're seeing, like informed consent, etc.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that they're not just, I guess it's not so fixed.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't know how students necessarily take to it. I think part of it is this is how I think. So maybe, there's a bias on that part. But to me, it's really interesting what's happening, again, to use that metaphor, what's happening under the hood.
Yeah.
Right? So if we're fixated on equipoise, so everybody learns equipoise, great. I think we should learn about equipoise.
Okay, so, and just for the people that still might be learning what equipoise is.
Sorry. So equipoise in the context of research is this idea that you have a balance between two possible treatments, or, and essentially the purpose of research is to break equipoise. It's to give you a sense of, A over B or B over A, or whatever the case might be.
Great.
But
that moment.
There you go. But that idea suggests that there's issues of uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So how do we deal with uncertainty? How do we deal with measurement? If what we're trying to measure is certain probabilities, how do we think through these probabilities? What are the ethical implications of thinking through probability?
Yeah.
And so to me, those are the skills those are some of the ideas that are transferable, whether you're doing public health research, whether you're doing clinical research, whether you're doing, more social science research. Everyone has to deal with those things. And the field of research ethics moves so quickly that it's impossible to stay on top of all the different permutations. So as long as you can sort of teach, I think, some of these fundamental ideas and get the students to try to think at a deeper level, then I think in the end, that's going to be beneficial for the student in the long run. At least that's my theory.
Yeah, no, it's good. And on the topic of uncertainty, are you finding that is an assumption that applies to lots of different topics that you cover, like that assumption?
Yeah, so we spent a couple of weeks on uncertainty in the research ethics course. We spent a couple of weeks on autonomy, a week on risk, a week on harm. The idea being that, and then in the tail end of the unit, we spend a few weeks on clinical trial designs and, research in public health. And at that point, then you can bring in these different ideas. The other thing I would add is that, again, I think it's really important being in Australia or being in New Zealand, for that matter. The idea of Aboriginal persons and Indigenous communities. And I think trying to tackle that as best as possible as someone who's not Indigenous, as someone who's an immigrant, both to Canada, where I'm from, and an immigrant here in Australia, try to struggle with that as well. So I guess that's another dimension as well.
Yeah, so actual context of where you're teaching in and countries changes sometimes the topics that you're going to consider as well.
Yeah, I think so. I think context is really important, and the contextual factors are really important as well. So yeah, I would say that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so is there anything like that you emphasize when you're teaching? Like,
that's a good question. Okay, so one thing I emphasize, again, because I think this is something that you take for granted coming from philosophy, but maybe less so coming from other disciplines, is the permission to criticize what you're reading. So, and permission to sort of say, I don't understand something. So one thing I try to instill in students, regardless of which level I'm teaching at or discipline or whatever, what field, is to say, you can question me and you can question the readings. And that's part of our job, is to sort of ask those questions, to be critical and to be constructive about it. So I think that's one of the things that I try to stress on, right? So another is sort of sticking close to text. I think that as teachers in ethics, in bioethics, we stress about people's writing. And I think we need to stress more about people's reading comprehension, because reading bioethics, especially more philosophical stuff, is difficult. And so I think that, again, trying to demonstrate to the students how to read these texts, what are the things as a teacher, what are the things that you're pulling out that you think are interesting, why, sort of breaking it down into bite-sized pieces. So I guess it's the point of emphasis will differ based on the topic, but I guess there's certain methods that you're trying to get at and trying to get the student to see throughout the unit.
Yeah, and you're actually going to text to be able to draw out those points and help people become more critical along the way.
Yeah. So for example, for me, text is critical.
Yeah.
It's not the sole, obviously there's oral communication, but it's certain that writing is a primary or one of the primary methods of communicating ideas. Yeah. And so to me, in our field, in bioethics, and so to me, it's critical that we understand how to read these texts, which is it's different than reading potentially other texts in other disciplines. And so regardless of the level I teach at, whether undergrads or whatever the case might be, like, I don't use textbooks. And that's not, and I have colleagues who have written great textbooks, so this is not a knock on textbooks.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll use like a chapter from a textbook here or there, but to me, I want students there reading the stuff that I'm reading.
Yeah.
I want them to struggle with the material that I'm struggling with. And I want to demonstrate that I struggle.
Yeah, okay. So you actually take a role of humility in this to actually say, like, we're all working to figure out and questioning what questions have been posed by these bioethicists.
Yeah, so there's a chapter that I used to use, that I use with the public health students, that I usually use in undergrad when I was teaching back in Canada. And there's a passage in it that I've read this article countless times. There's a passage I just don't understand. And my conclusion is, I actually think that even though I love the article, it's really well written, there's this passage that just doesn't make sense. The authors missed their mark. Yeah. And I think I say this to students and be like, look, I don't know if it's me or if it's the authors, right? But there's just this passage I just don't get. Here's what I think they're saying. I'm not entirely sure. And it doesn't detract from my admiration of the argument itself or my interpretation of the argument. And so I think humility, humility is one of them, but also just, I think demonstrating the struggle, demonstrating that you're getting your hands dirty that is the process. The process is the struggle with text.
I think the most pop culture reference would be Brene Brown's vulnerability. Is that what you're?
No, I don't know.
No, oh, you don't know Brene Brown?
No.
Not a philosopher, is a researcher, but also she talks about vulnerability and how you just say, like, it's hard. Okay. I struggle and I'm struggling with you.
Right. Okay. Yeah. There you go. That sounds like I need to look this
Sounds
up.
Like what you
Yeah.
Probably not in bioethics text just yet, but yeah, okay. So actually sharing that, like, there is a lens, everyone's bringing a lens to these texts that you're using. Everyone's going to be looking at it differently. And that also actually, it sounds like it creates a richness to the experience for you as well as a teacher.
Yeah, I think so, because I think for me, it keeps it as fresh as possible. So there's this balance in teaching where you can't reinvent the wheel every semester, because otherwise it's just too time intensive and too resource, like you as a resource, it's too much of your time. Yeah. So you're obviously going to repeat and refine as you move on and teach the course in subsequent years. But I think it's still being able to still see the text as something that's alive, or the ideas as something that's alive, rather than something that just becomes rote. Something that just becomes this mechanical thing. I think at that point, and I think most people would agree, at that point, it's probably time to change units that you're teaching, have that discussion with whoever's in charge and kind of change units. Because I think that comes across to students as well.
Yeah, okay. And treating it as like a living, bioethics as a living thing rather than a hypothetical.
Yeah, I guess what I mean by living is like something that, again, so this is might be my bias, because maybe this is like I'm thinking about what was the type of education that I like to receive. But to
Yeah,
me, it was when I saw my instructors struggling.
yeah,
It was when I saw my instructors being like, you know what, this is like a really difficult situation. I here's my opinion, but like, you wanna show the mess, right? You want to show, uh, like in math, you need to show your work, right? I
yeah,
think showing the work is as important as trying to get to the concepts themselves, because the concepts will change depending on the unit, obviously, right?
yeah,
But I think that the mechanics of what we do in bioethics, especially on the more conceptual stuff, which we then use in empirical bioethics and we use in various policy pieces and stuff, right? But that ability to struggle with ideas, to really try to tuck into ideas, I think that is something that we need to communicate to students in bioethics.
yeah. Permission to struggle.
Permission to struggle. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I like it. I like it. Now, is there anything that you avoid in your teaching of bioethics?
Funnily enough, I avoid principles. So that's not, okay, sorry, let me take a step back. That's not entirely true. But I try to avoid using principlism, not because I don't think there's virtues to a principlist approach.
Yeah,
Um, but it's more so that I think um, there's a tendency, and it's not on the part of the educators, because I think this is a conversation I've had with many people in many different universities,
yeah,
which is people tend to use principles as a formula, right? You use principle X, and these are the possible ways of using it, and here are your outputs when you use this particular principle.
yeah,
And so I try to avoid principles, not because I think they're necessarily bad things, but because I think from a pedagogical point of view, what I want students is to, again, to go back to sort of giving permission to struggle. I want you to struggle with ideas and problems. Principles are really helpful, but in certain times and places.
yeah,
And so I tend to not teach principlism, regardless of what unit I'm teaching. So I'll talk about autonomy, but I won't talk about the principle of autonomy, right? So I'll
yeah,
try to problematize, what do we mean by autonomy, right? So again, this is not a knock on Beecham and Childress and the principalists out there in bioethics. On the contrary, I think that what they do is actually, principlism at its best is quite subtle.
yeah.
And I think conveying that subtlety is actually kind of really difficult to do in a class. So that's something that I avoid, is actually the use of principles or principlism.
Yeah, so really that reinforces that idea. You want to explore what's under the hood and the problems that then have led people to develop things like principlism and led people to develop things, like ethics of care or things like that.
Yeah, and again, if you read the Principles of Biomedical Ethics, right?
Yeah,
If you read Beecham and Childress, they demonstrate how they're thinking through these principles and the nitty gritty and stuff. And you might have objections to their conclusions or their arguments. That's fine. That's part and parcel of what we
you
do.
want that. Yeah.
Exactly. But I think when we talk about the four principles, say in clinical ethics or something like that, everybody kind of forgets all the legwork Beecham and Children did, and they just see these four. And so I guess that's the distinction I'm trying to draw, I guess, is to, if you are going to use principles, again, I talk about the harm principle, for example. So it's not like I don't use principles at all, but actually the harm principle is a really good example of this. So if I talk about the harm principle, I make a point of pointing out, for example, that, this is credited to Mill, to J.S. Mill, but it's written on a book called On Liberty, right? The purpose of the book is actually a defense of liberalism and defense of liberty as a value, right? It's a couple of paragraphs that he wrote on the harm principle. And then sort of throughout this idea of coercion, I try to point out, sort of historical facts, like the fact that Mill believed that we ought to use harm as a justification for restrictions of another person's actions in contexts where there's equality. And there's sort of historical documents of him talking about this in the context of the Contagious Disease Acts in the 1800s when he was a parliamentarian in the UK. So again, it's this idea of, even if when we do use these principles, trying to actually at least demonstrate or at least suggest to the students, look, there's a lot going on under there, right? So we can talk about principles, we can talk, but again, yeah, keep coming back to the same ideas now. Yeah,
it's not just all boxed up neatly. There are things that have led to these these ideas coming about.
And even with med students, so I with med students, like I probably wouldn't even say words like autonomy or anything. To me, it's what is a concept they take for granted? Okay, let's blow it up, right? Because you're in there for maybe an hour or two, right? You're one lecture amongst, your 2 hours of hundreds and hundreds of hours of lectures that they have on whatever cell biology stuff like that. So I can't, if I talk about, this is what autonomy is. So to me, it's much more impactful, I think, to be like, okay, evidence-based medicine. You've heard a lot about it. Okay, what is evidence-based medicine? What do we mean by so this is a colleague of mine does a great job with this. What do we mean by evidence? What do we mean by medicine, right? What does it mean to be based on? And so then you just blow it up. And then the student oftentimes is confused, and that's what you want. You want the student to be in a position where they understand that at least it's difficult. Because I think that the clinicians I want to encounter as a patient, right? I'm not a clinician, so as a patient, the clinicians I want are the ones that accept that the complexity.
Like it's messy. We get it. Yeah. No, very interesting. And so I guess we're nearly wrapping up for the session, but my final question to you is, to all those other people teaching bioethics at all, what would be your one takeaway or bit of advice?
Bit of advice. I would say my bit of advice is to show. I'm gonna take the V word that you use, vulnerability.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think it's showing vulnerability. I think it's showing because regardless of the topic, it's demonstrating to your student that you struggle, because we all struggle with these ideas. That's how we write. That's the creative process, is a struggle, right? So I think we need to demystify this idea that what gets published in a paper or what gets published in a journal, that final product, that it's easy to get to. It's not. We know it's not. So let's show them a bit of the stuff that goes on behind the scenes.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think that also is very relevant in our current climate, where we're seeing things get published quickly on these topics, and we don't see the behind the scenes works and thoughts and struggles to actually come up with, like, how are we arguing this way or that way on the topics.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, very, very timely and appropriate. Well, Diego, thank you so much for your time today to talk about how you teach bioethics. It's been an absolute pleasure. And
my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I feel like I've got insight to your pedagogy of how you approached postgrad uni.
And listen, once we stop recording, I'll ask you if any of this actually came through when you were a student of mine.
Yes, I can give post-review feedback and actually say, what is the student experience? I'll have an extra comment at the end. Thanks so much, Diego.
Thank you.